On this episode of the show, I have with me Feross Aboukhadijeh. He is founder and CEO at Socket. We're going to be talking about the product, the problem space that Socket's working in and solving. We're also going to talk about the fact that they made an acquisition. We're going to kind of talk to Feross about that process, what the drivers were, the growth opportunities, and try to understand, what goes on behind the scenes when an acquisition happens. And Feross, I appreciate your time.
For sure. Yeah, great to be here, Amir.
Awesome. Before we start, could you tell everyone what Socket does at a high level?
Yeah, so, applications today are written with thousands, tens of thousands of open source libraries that kind of power the code. If you look at the, kind of the ratio of lines of code in an application, it's like 90% of the lines of code come from open source and 10% are actually written by, the developers at your company or, as part of the app, the first party part of the app. And, a ton of risk comes from all that open source code. A lot of times you don't know who wrote it. You don't know kind of who's behind it. You don't know if it's safe to update it or to kind of bring in new versions of that into your application. And so Socket can help with all that. We're basically, we call ourselves a software supply chain security platform. That's a lot of words, but, the supply chain is all about, kind of where the components of a product come from. You often hear that in the context of, physical products, like, all the little parts that you need to build the final product. But the same thing works in software. So software is also made up of a bunch of different pieces, and so we look at the security of that software supply chain.
Absolutely. I guess maybe to start with, I think it'd be a good starting point when you do talk about the security of the software development supply chain. What does that actually mean? What are we looking to protect in that case?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example, right? So I actually was an open source maintainer for most of my career before starting Socket. And what that meant is I would, write code and put it online for free and let people use it in their projects. And over time, a lot of companies started using my code in one way or another. And, my code actually now gets around 1 billion downloads a month. It's sort of honestly kind of scary and boggles the mind because that's a lot of responsibility, honestly, as a maintainer, that I feel like if I, put out a bad version or, somebody were to get access to my account and put something nasty and, something like a virus or something that, stole people's data into one of my open source packages, then, I don't know what the effect would be, but it would affect a lot of companies. That's something that kept me up at night as an open source creator and author myself. Was, wow, all these people are using this code and I better do a really damn good job of making sure that it's safe and secure and that it doesn't have vulnerabilities and that I'm protecting my account. But as a company, as the user of this software, the problem they face is basically that to build a modern application today, you kind of have to use a lot of open source software, and that's great. I love open source software. I want people to use more open source software. But there is this sort of risk of, even though the vast majority of people are good and the vast majority of open source code is awesome, there are bad actors trying to take advantage of the trust that's within that ecosystem. And so a lot of people think, oh, if the code is open source, it must be safe because, like, obviously it's open source. Anyone can look at it and identify problems and find, anything nasty that might be hidden in there. But the reality is, everyone thinks that someone else is doing the checking, and so they're like relying on the fact that someone must have evaluated this, and that isn't always the case. So it's usually not the case. In fact, is what we found. Most companies basically just in order to help their engineers keep up a high velocity and ship stuff quickly, they have a policy of just like letting anyone install any open source code that they want to, and that has risks, obviously. So happy to get into some examples of stories of different different attacks that have happened over the years. Some of them honestly could be in a Hollywood movie. They're so cool, but cool. Also pretty bad, but also kind of cool in the sense of the attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a lot of what we're seeing within the AI space, a lot of that's open source. And maybe 20 years ago, there was, maybe even a little further back, there was a lot more closed ecosystems, commercial software licensing that companies would go through because they felt it was more secure. But with with AI, I feel like that's almost flipped the script, and a lot of people are just, I mean, it's a bare necessity. I think when what you described and kind of the problem that could occur from an enterprise standpoint when developers are trying to move faster and install open source libraries, I guess before Socket or similar solutions, is from what you're saying, there really wasn't any way to kind of control that liability from both development and shipping of that code.
Yeah, excellent question. So before Socket, there was some solutions, but very, very incomplete. And we came in to basically do it right. And and I know a lot of companies probably say, "Oh yeah, we're the best," but I really do think that the gap we identified in the market was very, very real. I'll give you an example. So we were building an application called Wormhole. I was just building this with a friend, and it's a way to securely send files across the internet. You can think of it like Signal, but instead of for messages, it's for large files. So if you want to securely transfer files, you can use wormhole.app is the URL. And we were very, very concerned about the security of the application. And we did a lot of engineering to make sure that the design of the encryption was solid. It has end-to-end encryption and all that kind of good stuff. But the weakest link in the entire application was these dependencies that we were relying on. And what we figured out is what we learned, and anyone who's built an app in 2025 knows this, but you can't even get a Hello World basic website running without installing around 1,000 dependencies. Like literally 1,000 different open source projects go into making Hello World show up on the screen. Because React is so complicated, because these front-end frameworks, you end up bringing in these component libraries to build your UI, and before you know it, 2, 3, 4 packages you install, they each bring in several hundred or 1,000 dependencies, and then you end up with this sort of pile of just untold amounts of code. And so our feeling was, how can we tell our users that our app is secure if we didn't even look at that code, right? I mean, most companies have code review processes for the code that their own engineers write. You usually have at least one other person has to sign off on code before it goes out. But when it comes to open source code, it's just like we assume it must be safe. But in fact, it's like people that they don't even work with you. They're not even your colleagues. They're just random people. Again, mostly good people, but it's just kind of weird that we care so much more about the first party code than the third party code, when at the end of the day, it all gets bundled into one application and it runs as one unit. And it doesn't really matter whether you wrote the code or someone else wrote the code. It's all part of your application at the end. So what the previous solutions would do is they would basically, there were these databases of vulnerable packages. You probably heard the advice, like update your apps, update your software to stay secure, because the updates have security fixes. And so pretty much like there's this US government run database of all the vulnerable software in the world. And it tells you, version 1.0 is vulnerable, but if you upgrade to version 1.1, then, you'll be safe. And it tells you exactly, what version to go to be safe from each vulnerability. And so what pretty much every company in our space did for like 20 years before we started was they just would look at what software you're using and then compare it to this, US government database that's free for anyone to access, and just tell you if software you're using was found in that database. So honestly, very little value add, like pretty thin, like layer on top of public data that anyone could use. And somehow this became like it's a massive industry. It's like $1 billion plus industry of software companies just doing that thin, almost no value add, in my opinion, service. And the big flaw they have is, again, they're not actually able to detect the most interesting kinds of attacks, which is like if my account were to get compromised, God forbid, right? And like somebody were to put something nasty into one of my open source packages that's used by literally billions of downloads a month, immediately, as soon as if that were to happen, people would start to get compromised immediately. Anytime they run their install command and get their environment set up or update their dependencies, you start having people getting compromised. And all the tools out there would be checking this like government database that's really stale and like takes time for these things to get in there. And so there'd be no way to actually catch the attack. You could just get affected immediately. And so the database is too slow. The database doesn't get updated fast enough. It's very incomplete. And then the worst part of all is that all these findings, like all these kind of malicious attacks, don't even get put into the database. They don't even let those go in there because they consider them to be malicious attacks and not vulnerabilities, which are technically different. Like a vulnerability is something that is an accident, is a bug, and a malicious attack is something that's intentional. And so literally all the existing tools can't even catch the most scary and most interesting attacks. And so when we looked at this, we're just like, this is crazy. How has no one solved this? And then we started looking at it, and it's like, oh, it's actually very hard to solve this problem. There's a reason why no one's solved it, and or no one's even tried to solve it, right? And so we can get into kind of why it's hard, but the point is, we were just the first, I guess, that was ambitious enough to say, we're just going to solve the real problem here. Like, we're going to just do it. And AI obviously helped us a lot, and we could talk about that if you're interested. But that's why we exist, is we actually solve the real problem, which is, how do I know that the thing I'm downloading and I'm about to run on my computer and put into my application, hasn't had any nasty code added into it, and I want to know that proactively and be very preventative about it.
I love that explanation, and maybe just a quick follow up to that is, I've been speaking to security leaders about attack surface area expanding with Gen AI, and when we talk about development, the one couple of use cases they talk about is within the actual supply chain process of seeing injections of poor logs. They were like, you could be surprised that there's people trying to infiltrate log files and feed poor log file data in to throw off whatever the company has set up, whether it's an AI to check those in or it's manual, whatever it is. But it seems like the attack surface area keeps expanding as we are going into that next frontier. When you think about AI and you think about where Socket is positioned, I mean, that seems like something very natural. I guess that's probably something you're already doing, and I was kind of curious.
Yeah. Well, so with AI, the way to think about it is, it helps developers write more code. I don't think it's going to replace developers anytime soon, my opinion. I think people are going to be way more productive. And so if you think about how it affects security, I think so. There's sort of public figures on and research that's been done on how many bugs or vulnerabilities, or basically software defects is what they call them, are introduced for every 1,000 lines of code that a developer writes. And I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it was something like 7, or which is a lot, by the way, for every 1,000 lines of code, 7 bugs. Not great. But with AI, you're basically going to have every developer writing 2 times as much code, maybe 3 times as much code. And so I think the way that it affects security, just kind of, baseline assumption I would make is that you're going to have just more code, therefore more vulnerabilities, therefore more defects for every 1,000 lines of code that are written. So that's already going to increase the kind of surface area, because we're just going to be writing more software. There's going to be more software. There's going to be therefore more bugs. But the other area that it kind of really affects is that if you think about, like, when you're listening to like a talk and you take notes, you learn a lot more. You pay more attention when you're kind of writing things yourself. When you're reviewing something that's been written by somebody else, it's a lot easier to skim and to skip over things and to not really process it in as close to of detail. So I think, that's probably, in addition to the fact that there's more bugs from more code being written, I think we're also going to see just like more oversights and people just accepting the AI generated code without thinking through the implications or really assessing it carefully, and just kind of vibe coding their way through things. And then the kind of final area where I think AI affects security is when you look at the code that's written by most of these tools, they do bring in open source code quite frequently as a way of solving the problem that you've given to them. And often we'll see them pulling in open source dependencies that have issues, and in some cases they don't even exist. Like, they'll hallucinate a open source library that if such an open source library existed, it would make solving the problem that you asked them to solve pretty easy. And so they'll assume, oh yeah, there's probably something that exists here, and hallucinate an entire package that doesn't exist. And so obviously that creates a huge vector for attack, because now you have your AI agent is attempting to bring in a third-party package that doesn't even exist, and an attacker could go and kind of register that and squat on the name. And so we've actually someone's coined a term for this. It's called slop squatting. Obviously AI slop and typo squatting, the combination of those two, and you get slop squatting. And so that's a huge problem. And even beyond just the slop squatting stuff, there's also just the fact that LLMs are trained on data that they found on the internet, and oftentimes something that was secure, that was best practice at one point in time, isn't anymore. And if the training data is 6 months out of date, they could be recommending a package that's been deprecated or no longer recommended or has had a security incident or issue since the time the LLM was trained. And so our solution to that at Socket is you should use the Socket MCP server so that your AI agent can call out to Socket and check the security of packages that it's using in its code. It's really simple. You just install that Socket MCP server, and then your AI can just, anytime it's touching third-party code, it can just quickly check with Socket and say, hey, is this thing safe? And we've done our whole full assessment with our own AI, obviously, and spent a ton of money and expense trying to do all this, and already have a verdict for whether your AI agent should continue to use that or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, obviously this is it sounds like it's a growing problem. You put a solution in place that makes sense. It sounds like your solution covers a very specific area. Sounds like it's evolving as well to incorporate more of what we're seeing. I was going to ask you, obviously, you had mentioned there was an acquisition you made, and I'm always curious when we get a founder that's kind of gone through the acquisition in terms of how they looked at their own business and saw an opportunity to either add specific something to their company. I'm kind of curious if you could kind of walk us through that a little.
Yeah, totally. So we're about a 50-person company today, and I would have never guessed that we would be acquiring other companies at this stage. It wasn't in my plans or on our roadmap in any way. Our engineering team is amazing, and we tend to just build stuff ourselves, and really proud of the stuff that we build. But we met a team of just amazing academics over at Kawana, and it just seemed like a really, really good fit for a number of reasons. One is Kawana builds something called reachability analysis, and really what it comes down to at the end of the day is just a lot of security tools find a lot of stuff, and if you think about what a security tool typically does, is it's generally they're just generating alerts, ringing a bell and saying, hey, we found a thing. Hey, we found a thing. Hey, we found a thing, over and over again, right? That's pretty much, you could describe 95% of security tools that way. And the problem, though, is obviously the more times you ring the bell and say, hey, we found something bad, the more you as a developer start to get desensitized and think, especially if those findings are a lot of times wrong or just overstated, the significance is overstated, you get a lot of what's called alert fatigue, and you just tend to tune it out. And so this happens to a lot of security products. They just end up getting either ignored or they get turned off after a while because it's too noisy, and people just say, hey, 90% of the time this thing's just the boy who cried wolf, and so it ends up just being super annoying to work with, frankly, right? And so what you can do is, using some really cool computer science, is you can actually trace through your application and figure out whether there's any chance that your application could get to the vulnerable function within the open source code. And so if you know that only this function is vulnerable, but you can prove that your application isn't using that function, then you're safe from the problem, because there's just no way for an attacker to ever get your code to run the vulnerable function. So while it technically is there, it can't actually get ever called in your application, and so you're safe. And so their technology has been able to, through, like I said, really cool academic research that they've been working on for a long time. Literally, one of the professors who came over as part of the acquisition has been studying this stuff for 20 years. And a lot of the folks on the team are his PhD students. They've been really focused on trying to understand this problem space. So they've been able to get an 80% reduction in the number of alerts that you have to process. So it just makes the tool way, way more high signal for people. And so, that we looked at that technology and we're like, okay, we were going to build that, but they've already built it, and it's literally better than anything else on the market that we've seen. And we've looked at our, we have some competitors that have started to try to do similar things. And we're just like, we could build it, or we could just join forces with this awesome team and just bring them on board. And they were super aligned, culturally with us, very, very technical team. That's really important when you're doing an acquisition, that, because most acquisitions fail for one reason or another. due to technical challenges or just due to like, culture mismatch between the teams. So one of the best parts about like this team is that they just really are super technical. They're almost all engineers on the team. Like it's just they're able to just plug right in to our team, and we all get along in it. We all understand each other, and we all have the same culture of like craftsmanship, and like caring about the work we put out. And so that was a really, really key part of why I thought it made sense to take the chance. Because, I mean, a lot of acquisitions, I don't know what the percentage is, but, the advice I had been given by folks when we were considering doing this was, hey, you got to watch out with acquisitions because, most of them fail. And it's just a waste of time for everybody and a lot waste of money, waste of time. Yeah, we've been really, really happy to see that didn't happen with us here. And yeah, it's been going really well.
That's cool. I mean, it's interesting. It obviously wasn't on your radar. Does that change your perspective moving forward? If you find complementary, features, products, teams that you would consider doing this again, or was it truly one of those? You know what? It was just the stars aligned and we found the perfect team. Because you do say obviously it is risky as you described it.
Yeah, I would be open to doing it again. I mean, we had a really positive experience with it. I think the bar has to be really high though. Again, like culturally, technically, I guess we didn't touch on this yet, but also our products were super complementary. Like if you think about, what we were missing was exactly what they built, and then what they were missing was exactly what we built. And so, there was like no waste in the sense of, the team was really happy, I think, that they don't have to throw away anything that they built, which is very common in acquisitions. You often, a lot of the product that the team has worked on that's being, for the team that's being acquired, they have to kind of throw it away and start over, or just like join existing teams within the acquirer. And, that can be, at least to engineers, I think that can be not the best feeling. And so this was just another way we were super aligned it was like, oh, we literally, you plus us is stronger together. So, let's just do it. And so, I mean, I'll be open to it again. Obviously the bar has to be super high but yeah, I would just, yeah, I mean, definitely did not expect that, we'd be doing something like this as small as we are as a company. So it was kind of a surprise.
Absolutely. I guess as you kind of were talking about that complementary nature of a product, and you obviously knew this team and you had to evaluate where things fit and then potentially your roadmap. When you were looking at those things, and obviously, as you mentioned, wasn't on the radar, how did you see the product? And obviously from afar, it's different when you acquire it and it's your business, but how were you kind of envisioning the two product lines working complementary with each other? And then how has reality been?
Yeah, I mean, we envisioned that the products would just integrate into one product actually. So it's less of one of these acquisitions where you're just adding another SKU and then, sell we're not, I mean, Socket isn't a conglomerate where we have, 25 different products and, we're acquiring in things like that. Like it's more like, our product was missing a feature, their product was missing a feature, and then we combine, and now we have one product that's just stronger for the combination, if that makes sense.
That does. And I guess as you've kind of have assimilated that team, does the product roadmap start evolving differently because you do have some different capabilities and different features that you previously hadn't had?
Yeah, I mean, I think the team there is super, like I said, super awesome, and I think there's areas that we are interested in potentially expanding into in the future in other parts of application security, and their skills around static analysis are like really relevant, and so I know there's interest from them and from us, the combined team now, to kind of explore that once we get through the integration part of the phase, which is what we're in now, right? We're just trying to get things integrated so we can get this in our customers' hands as quickly as possible. But after that, absolutely, yeah, the roadmap is going to be much better with them involved.
Awesome, man. Well, it's not always where you get to speak to somebody who's recently gone through the acquisition process and kind of outlining their experience. I guess final question for you, and I'm just kind of more curious, when you do go through an acquisition process and having to actually go through And as you mentioned, you hadn't done it before. Going through the actual process and the legality and all those different steps that you have to go through. Just kind of curious what your thoughts are and what your experience was.
Yeah. I think that, these things always take longer than you want, because there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot more paperwork than you'd think is needed. But you got to check all the boxes and make sure that you're not missing anything. Yeah, I don't know. I think it was about what I expected. Maybe like slightly, maybe took a couple weeks longer than I thought, but it was about what I expected. I had a company that was acquired once before, actually, my first startup before Socket. It was a pretty small acquisition, but I had some taste of the process there. We sold our startup to Yahoo, and that was a very eye-opening process because they actually bought our whole company. They bought the entity. We became like a subsidiary, and then I think probably ultimately they shut it down. But they did buy our whole company, and so I got a little bit of a taste of like what is that like, and the 60-page acquisition agreements and negotiating all the different terms and all that kind of stuff. It's not that fun. It's really not that fun. It's like super super dense, and very very. It's a lot of it is thinking about downside scenarios and like what would happen in different bad cases that you hope never happens, and so it's a lot of it also is just is probably never going to matter in reality, right? So I don't know, but you got to do it. It's just what it is. It's just what it is.
Absolutely. I love it. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us and kind of sharing your insights for us. If somebody does have a question either about Socket or just about going through the acquisition process, if it's going to be new for someone, is there a good way of connecting with you just to ask you a follow-up question?
Yeah, I always love to talk to people, especially other founders, or especially potential customers too. So you can email me. It's just my first name, Feross @socket.dev. So that's our domain is socket.dev if you want to check it out. And I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn and all the usual stuff as well if you search for me. But email is best. I'll more likely to see it if you send me an email. And yeah, always happy to talk to other founders and do what I can to help. It's really hard. It's honestly really hard building a company. It's been really fun, but it's just it's really hard. A lot of stuff goes into it. So I always love to help others if I can, and I've had a ton of help along the way too. So always love an opportunity to kind of pay it forward if I get the chance.
Awesome, man. Definitely. People can definitely listen for those and obviously reach out with relevant questions. But again, thanks for being on. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah. Thanks, Amir. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This was fun.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think we talked about obviously the product, the problem, where the product is evolving to. We talked about an acquisition and how that fits into the Socket ecosystem and kind of looking forward and some of the, what you have to go through to get acquired. And obviously this would be a great episode if you're a founder or thinking about being a founder to share with somebody else and spread the knowledge. I'd appreciate that. Also, if you could like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.